Sunday, and we are ready to jump into the rotation. Cue that beautiful theme music. All right, welcome everyone. I hope you're having a beautiful Sunday morning. We're getting ready to jump into a new episode of the rotation with a very special guest today, coming to us live from Brooklyn, New York. Imani Dawson. Imani, welcome to the rotation. How you doing?
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here with you on a Sunday morning just to talk cannabis and talk life. And you
Well,
have the best theme music of any podcast I've been on.
well, thank goodness it's also royalty free, so we don't have to pay people for it. But for those folks who are listening at home and don't know Imani actually serves on the national board of NORML alongside myself. And, since I've had the opportunity to serve on the NORML board over the past year, I got to say that Imani is, I would say, one of my closest friends on the board and an amazing human being who's doing some really big things in another state, which is really progressing rapidly when it comes to ending prohibition and really taking off in the cannabis industry. And that's New York. Imani, tell us a little bit about how New York has changed so much over the past, 3 years since you've seen the advent of the end of prohibition there.
Well, thanks for the question. And I am so touched that I'm one of your closest friends on the board. I feel like we are comrades at arms. We have the same goals for sure. What I'll say about New York is that I was part of a group of advocates that pushed for an equity-centered legalization approach in New York, and it took 7 years and lots of fighting and 2 governors for implementation, but it did. Legalization passed in March 2021, and the past 3 years have really been about implementation. And we are the first state to attempt to legalize in this way, where we're giving communities and folks who are most harmed by prohibition, the war on drugs, an opportunity to enter the space first. And that does not come without its share of bumps and bruises. So when I think about our rolling out, I think best of intentions. I think about the hurdles, which include people and organizations that have sued because they want to be at the front of the line and they have an issue with people who, from, the sort of people of color, justice involved communities getting a first crack. I think there's also the dream of giving people the opportunity to enter the space first, but without resources, them not really being able to achieve that. And then just regulatory hurdles and delays. So I think that New York has yet to realize its promise. Um, and it's been a rough road, but I do think that we are making strides.
That's comforting to hear that at least there's some type of progress, that there's the ability for folks to possibly get into the industry. Carlos, you always wanted to get into this industry as a small business owner, as a Latino business owner. Tell us how you came about with Chillum and why you got into it, and what gives you hope for what they're doing in New York, like you might have just laid out.
I mean, I've always wanted to own a dispensary. Chillum is based off of a lot of the dispensaries that I worked at back in California. Just the style of everything and how everything's kind of like weighed out and done out here. I borrow a lot from like old school California style, I think. I really like, I don't know. I really wish that Florida goes about implementing adult use or implementing the cannabis industry in much the same way that New York has, because it's completely opposite over here. I think Cano wanted me to talk about this because I mean, I really want to bitch about Trulieve this episode. No, it's a monopoly here. It's corporate interests. It's really made in such a way that I mean it's pretty fucking racist. I'll tell you that. Not only do they have like a system here where it's like tokenized to allow like a black farmer to enter into the business, but they still haven't even handed out that license.
They like one black farmer.
Yeah, there was the what do you call it? The Pickford license. It was supposed to be distributed to one black farmer. And the idea was to make sure that at least one black farmer got into it because, you had to have 30 years in the business to get a license in Florida at one time. And there weren't any black farmers that qualified for that. So, it became a token system where, okay, we'll do the Pickford license. That license still hasn't been given out. The state has been sued a number of different times, I think, by now. Because of that license, they don't give a fuck. They're still not giving it out. People just can't get into the business here. You know what I mean? Think of just plain people, not just minorities. I understand that I have a Cuban background, but I have an MBA. I run a successful business here. I should be able to, and I qualify as a cannabis expert. I at least like to think, and I should be able to pay a license fee and open up a dispensary the way I'd like to open up a dispensary, and I'm not allowed to. As a matter of fact, I'm probably going to have to stop selling hemp pretty soon. So yeah.
But wait, I thought you had a license. Why would you have to stop selling hemp?
Because there's bills going through the legislature right now that would cap the levels of THC in hemp. It would not allow for people to sell CBN or CBG. I'd probably be only allowed with the THC levels allowed. It would only allow me to sell like isolated CBD. I don't even think full spectrum CBD will be allowed. So, I mean, we'll see how that works out. But there are people in our legislature right now that are trying to get rid of the hemp industry.
I have so many thoughts about Florida, and I'm going to limit them to cannabis for this conversation because that's what we're here to talk about. But I think what I want people to understand is that when legislation or any protections are given to people of color, ultimately everyone benefits. And people have a very sort of divide and conquer mentality, like it's a zero-sum game. And if like we help these poor Black and brown people over here, we're gonna suffer, when in fact, the more inclusive things are, the better it is for everyone. Because to me, what it seems like is, the sort of racist approach, if you'll forgive my, sort of unapologetically Black lens on Florida, but this racist approach to like governance is a cover for big business, at least in this case, right? Like,
absolutely a cover for big
if
business.
only one or two companies are allowed to function, that's bad for consumers. That's bad for the market, right? Like, it's just bad overall. So that's really unfortunate. And I would urge people in Florida to continue to fight at the ballot box where you can be heard. Like, vote for people with pro cannabis inclusive policies once you get legalized. I know that that's happening, and vote against people who are just blindly supporting corporate interests.
So Imani, so as a cannabis activist in the state of Florida, I'm gonna have to ask you for some advice, because I'm learning more and more as I progress as an activist that the best way to approach cannabis activism is to get people to vote out bad politicians.
Right.
we've done so much here in Florida to have this done, right? We've had the hemp industry grow here in Florida under Nikki Fried. We had a constitutional amendment passed by, what was it? It was 72% of the voters in Florida in 2016. I'm willing to bet there's more people that are pro cannabis now, but 70% of the voters voted for a constitutional amendment to allow for medical marijuana. Yet our legislator does not allow the will of the people, if you will. The best way to progress as a cannabis activist is to push bad politicians out of office, right? How do I get people to give a fuck? The thing is that everybody cares about what's going on in a national sense, on a federal level. Trump, Joe Biden, all this crap, right? You know, you might get some AOC, and you might get some, fuck Matt Gaetz, and you might get a little bit here and there, but nobody cares about what's going on in their city politics, their county politics, or their state politics. Nobody can name their state legislator, right? Nobody can tell you who's the senator they vote for, right? All they can tell you is fuck Joe Biden or fuck Donald Trump.
Right.
So how do you get people to give a fuck? Because it's the only way to allow people to get their freedom back, especially here in Florida. And it seems like nobody cares.
I mean, that's a hard question, Carlos. I mean, the answer is organizing, and it's simple but not easy, right? You need like a groundswell of people, but it's also because, and we could talk about this all day, but just the way that our educational system functions at this point, I think most people lack the ability to think critically. And that's just my sort of general analysis of the American public. Fight me. Like, that's where I am at this point. But I think that the key is to really like take it to folks and explain the consequences on a macro level, a micro level, right? Like, how could better cannabis legislation benefit those folks in the hood? Maybe you get, increased access to different products, right? Like, having competition is good. If you're somebody who takes medical cannabis, or maybe your grandma takes medical cannabis, and there are just two companies that offer everything, then you're limited to whatever they do. But what about the innovations coming from other people? Like, having expanded like licenses, giving people an opportunity means that you get better products and you have a better experience as a consumer. But it also offers an opportunity for economic growth, right? Like, that was a big selling point in New York. Everybody's talking about generational wealth and how cannabis is going to help facilitate that. And, jury's out. We remain hopeful, not quite there yet. But if you talk about the fact that like the corner boys who are not really making any money could build a business that's potentially worth hundreds of thousands or millions, then you're going to grab people's attention. So it's grinding work, it's thankless work. But if we look to the past, to other movements, it really comes from organizing people to balance out these politicians that are not doing anything because they know they don't have to. They're not going to get voted out, right? People are just voting for their team, right? So in order to really move the dial, like, education is a big part of that. And if that means having a town hall, that means stopping people on the street and having a conversation. If that means like hosting info sessions about like getting into cannabis, right? Like, and then it's like, well, if you really want to get into cannabis, you've got to be an advocate, because that's what happened in New York. Anyone that learned about cannabis as a potential industry eventually becomes an advocate here. And that's ultimately what moved the dial. And it's not a fast process. Like, it's still, people think of New York as this big blue state. And really the reality is that New York City is very blue. And then we have our red pockets. We have our share of sundown towns here. But it took 7 years. So it may take a while. But if you are steadfast and you organize, eventually people will get it. I mean, I think about the legislation that passed to give prisoners the right to vote in Florida. That's some of the most progressive in the entire country. So it can be done. It just is not easy or fast.
Hi, Gary. Look, Gary's back.
Well, Gary's fixing his tech issues. We'll come back to Gary once he's settled. But Imani, you do bring up some really good points there. It does take organizing, and that's why we have an organization like Suncoast NORML in the Bay Area in Central Florida stepping up to the plate to make that happen. I mean, we've been around now. Carlos, we're going into our 10th year, man. We'll be celebrating 10 years this September as a chapter.
Yeah, it's crazy. We've been at this fight for so long.
Yeah.
We have made progress. Don't get me wrong. I think just right now there's just I don't even think it's just America. I think worldwide the right is just having a moment.
You're right.
And
but it's a backlash against the fact that, globally, we're moving into a space where, like, they're really, we're right at the cusp of having like diverse societies where power is shared, and the old guard, most of the old guard is really uncomfortable with that, and I think as Americans have to face that ugly reality, right?
well, I'll tell you guys this. I think Florida could use a whole new Senate. The entire thing can just go. The
I
Democrats.
think you use a new governor, but that's me.
I think we could definitely use a new governor. I think about 1/3 of the House is okay, but the Senate, all of them can go. Everybody from Musan to I pledge my allegiance to Shervin Jones and my undying loyalty to Jones in one of our past episodes, and I am going to take that back since he voted favorably for the hemp bill, even though he talked so much crap about it. I really feel that at least the Senate is just completely made up of just Republicans and just Democrats that just vote with the Republicans.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go ahead and say something right now. I'm gonna issue a challenge to Nikki Fried, who is chair of the Florida Democratic Party. Nikki, give us better candidates. Because as Carlos just said, for an incumbent Senate leader to sit there on our show 2 weeks ago and say that he's in support of what we're trying to do, and then you telling us that he voted favorably for this shitty bill, which is going to put you possibly out of business and 10,000 other people, shame on him and shame on Florida Democrats for having those type of leaders.
Have you guys checked his donations? Did he get a donation from the industry? Could that have been part of that shift?
I haven't checked, but I wouldn't be surprised, man.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. Gary, you're our political director. Tell us a little bit about the donations that the industry players have been spreading around in Tallahassee. Oh, Gary, you're on mute, brother. You want to unmute yourself? There you go.
Yeah, I had to throw out my entire virtual background just to be able to keep it going. We have a lousy weather over here right now, and I'm in the country, and well, what the hell? I blame Matt Gaetz. Doesn't make any difference.
Oh, blame Matt Gaetz.
Anyways, a lot of people in Tallahassee really do vote based on who's pushing the envelope, and I mean the lobbyists who have this envelope full of money that's pushing them towards it, and they tell these guys what to say, what to do. However, there are other forces at play here, and that includes the fact that you can't look at one individual vote, because sometimes people vote for a technical reason as opposed to a ethical reason or a finality reason. Sometimes you vote yes just so the bill will move forward so we can fix it before it gets to the end. And that includes floor amendments and all the things that may be happening. So just basing it on one vote isn't always the best way to do it. Although it makes for great op research to say, well, look, this person voted against this one, this person voted against that one. When you're talking about technical votes that really didn't have anything to do with the final outcome. So that's the craziness of politics. Wouldn't you agree, Imani?
It's definitely crazy here. I mean, I think every legislature is different. I will for sure tell you that in New York, like ground like doing campaigns coming from the grassroots have been successful. So I think you could launch like a Save Our Hemp campaign, do some social around it, even buy ads and bring it to consumer attention. Like part of what's going on is that people aren't paying attention, and that's just something you could do to gain attention. When we were trying to get legalized here in New York, I created a Faces of Fair Legalization campaign for our local DPA chapter. And there we just used everyday people who were in favor of cannabis and also legislating in a fair and equitable way. And I think everything moves the dial.
Well,
You have to understand, though, that sometimes they do throw out red herrings so that you distract the activists. You distract the people who are paying attention, so that they'll look in the other direction while they're doing something else someplace else. And that happens quite a bit often here in Florida. They will go ahead and throw a cap on there, which they ultimately don't intend on moving forward, just so that we won't notice that someplace else they're doing something totally heinous, and we are not even catching that at all. So that's
Imani, you got to excuse me, Imani, because I'm not really familiar with how legalization is like kind of rolled out in New York. Can you kind of break it down for me? Maybe we can learn something new about how we can proceed in Florida.
Legalization itself, or just like the equity,
the progress that we're at, how the business has come forward, and
well, it's not without its challenges. So I think that, like, there are stages to things, and we had a really triumphant moment when legalization and like equity centered legalization passed in 2021, and now we're like 2.5 years later, and there is a lot of frustration, a lot of angst. They've issued hundreds of licenses, but only dozens of stores are operational. We have a pop-up gray market that's emerged because cannabis is legal now, and they don't care about regulation, so they're moving quickly and providing the community, which has depressed the price of cannabis for the legal operators. So there are some challenges. It's not perfect by any means, but I do believe it's a phase. Even our governor has expressed frustration with the proliferation of these pop-ups, and I think greater enforcement is coming. It's going to be civil enforcement, because in New York there's no appetite to criminalize anyone, even though most of the actors in that sort of gray pop-up market are not in fact people who were most harmed by prohibition.
Let's talk about New York for a second, where we're talking about broken window policies, and we're talking about stop and frisk policies that have had no problem gaining popularity in the face of adversity from actual voters. That has been the issue, and sometimes it has to do with who's pushing the bill forward. Like, for instance, the whole legalization came from this huge omnibus bill that Andy Cuomo pushed forward, and then he had his problems. And so he had to back out, and then we had to deal with the assemblymen who also have envelope pushing issues. So that was another thing that we had problems with in New York. New York is a very interesting and complex political.
Yeah, well, Cuomo was definitely pushing a pro-corporate approach to cannabis, which is what's happening in most states. And the activists and their partners in the legislature, because it helps to have an elected official that you can work with, were not okay with it, which is why it ultimately didn't pass until 2021. And then politically, he was in a vulnerable position, needed to pass something, and the legislature was able to leverage that to get the cannabis legalization that they wanted. His cannabis legalization would have, while not as crazy as the one proposed by Florida, if you'll pardon my French, I don't know how to describe it any other way, would have ultimately
fucking
allowed
crazy.
the the registered operators to be the first movers in the cannabis space, and that's explicitly what we did not want.
Yeah, I'm happy you guys struck that down.
Well, go ahead, Carlos.
I was gonna say I'm happy Gary brought up stop and frisk, because I spent a lot of time in New York City from like 2008, 2011, and two things stuck out primarily: the stop and frisk thing, like be just a cop stopping me on the subway and being able to just, hey, what do you got on you? That was insane to me. And the whole idea too, like people act like cannabis dispensaries weren't a thing, and they were a thing in 2008 and 2010 in New York City. They were definitely underground, but there was a beautiful network of legacy market dispensaries, real legitimate style dispensaries with menus, and they'd come to your house.
Well, I was gonna say, like, the legacy market had been mostly, at least in my experience, and you've been in the game for a long time, so you may even be aware of some situations that I am not. But what I experienced in New York as in 2008, I wouldn't even have called myself a consumer at that point. Like, I was an occasional social consumer. It wasn't something that I was doing all the time, but it was definitely delivery based.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, there was a fancy high end network, but I feel like that was for a very privileged part of the New York market. And for the regular Joes, it was kind of like delivery. You had your plug, and you sort of chose from whatever your plug had available. And there wasn't always the huge selection. I think most of it was Cali stuff. And it was also expensive.
Well, that was what I was going to bring up, Imani, is that your experience on the ground in New York, you talk about this gray market. Is the supply to the gray market coming from other states? Is it homegrown New York stuff? Or are we still in a spot where, like in the 70s and 80s, it's coming from other countries?
That is a great question. So just based on my anecdotal knowledge, I would say that most of it is coming from other states. I think a lot of it is coming from Cali. But I'm not like an expert on it, so I don't know. I don't think there's a huge international trade anymore. I think that there are a lot of legal states with excess.
Oh, yeah.
And despite, tracking software and the best of intentions, that, enterprising people are finding a way to capitalize on it, because that's what enterprising people do. So, yeah, I mean, I think that it feels a little bit like the gold rush. But as a consumer, I'm aware, like, this is not permanent. It's gonna, it's kind of like make what money you can now, because in a year, maybe 5, because things move like very slow, on a bureaucratically when we're dealing with government. But this whole like pop-up dispensary on every corner is going to stop.
Yeah.
Let's talk for a minute about historically what New York has meant culturally to the cannabis industry. We talk about Harlem in the 1930s and 40s. I mean, that was the golden age.
I love that, Gary. There are all these like jazz songs that like reference cannabis and stuff, and
they're Reefer Man by Cab Calloway.
Yeah.
Chris, of course you'd know the song. I'm like, yeah, there were songs. He's like this one.
Yeah.
That's hilarious. No, so
I get low, I get high.
Yes.
Okay, I see everyone knows them. My preferred cannabis songs come out of hip hop in the 90s. I'll be 100. That's my generation. But you're absolutely right. Like, New York has been this cultural touchstone in cannabis culture for almost 100 years or more. And like, even from its origins. We know that cannabis, using it, like consuming it, other than like places in the United States where indigenous people were using it and hemp was grown and stuff, but like the actual psychotropic part of cannabis comes from Mexicans coming in, bringing this plant that they use medicinally and spiritually, and connecting with Black artists who immediately adopted it. And that was part of the reason why prohibition, occurred, because it was coming, it was being used by Black and brown communities, which immediately posed the threat. So when I think about New York now, and just even from that time, it is considered the largest cannabis, market in the world, doing billions, even before cannabis was legal here. If you wanted to access cannabis, it was easy to access it, for sure. I think about the New York style and hip hop and like graffiti and the different elements, and how closely hip hop, cannabis became tied to that. I think there's also this counterculture, not so much in New York, other than like a Woodstock, but there are also people who didn't, like our founder Keith Strout, that didn't want to play by the rules, recognized that it was inherently wrong to criminalize cannabis, and made it his life's work to fight it. So
yeah, shout out to Keith. I mean, Keith is 80 years old and still serving as general counsel to NORML.
Still smoking.
It's still token. Yeah. And that does kind of segue into the next part I want to talk about, is that the future of cannabis activism, right? We're only halfway there in this country. 25 states have adopted some form of adult use. But what you don't see is really a true end to prohibition, even in legal states. New York is one of the few states I feel has gotten it right, in that you can smoke cannabis anywhere you can basically smoke a cigarette. But in Florida, it's a dirty little secret. You got to own your own home, and then you have to do it in that home. If your landlord doesn't like it, they can prevent you from smoking. You can't smoke in any type of public housing. You can't smoke it on the street. You can still be arrested for that. Even in Colorado, I went there a few years back for 420 celebration. The Whalers are on stage. People are sitting there chiefing and on blankets and watching, and the cops are walking around giving people $1,000 tickets for public smoking. So
actually, it's not unusual. There's a lot of states that have very, very similar laws in regards to public use, where you have to be in a private space where you, or a private space where you have permission to be able to utilize it. In Canada, they also have it where it's mirrored against the tobacco laws, which means you can smoke a joint walking down the street, even if it's 20 below zero, but you can't go inside. And it's somewhat the way it is here in Florida. Although we're here in Florida, we have nice outdoor areas. But if you're in a public space, you're screwed.
Well, one thing I found interesting about Florida, at least in Tampa, is that I've gotten stopped in the club. You can't smoke that in here, and then I pulled out. I was like, well, actually, I bought it down the street at Chillum, and it is a legal hemp product. This is not marijuana, and so the bouncers will leave me alone after that. But it's ironic that I even have to have that conversation. Like,
bouncer.
That's part of the that. To me, that exactly exemplifies why an organization like NORML exists. Because to your point, Chris, it really is a process. We aren't there in terms of we are there in terms of consumer approval, but in terms of like normalizing cannabis, so you could like consume cannabis just in the same way that you would take a drink and no one's gonna harass you about it. We're definitely not there. Okay. And the fact that it's legal, but you still have to hide it, shows that there's work to be done.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why, NORML, as we look to the future, I think that we're really laser focused on ensuring that people, particularly people who live in states, actually have consumer protections. They're protected in the workplace, and they are not like penalized and losing their children, and some of the collateral consequences that we see associated with cannabis use, because we are still in a space where people are judging you, and there is still this like stigma associated with it. If you can't smoke in public.
Who was, yeah, you can't smoke outside. Who was that NORML attorney that we had on?
Bondi.
Joe Bondi.
Bondi. We were talking about it with Bondi. Bondi was basically made the argument saying, we gave up a lot to gain a little bit, and yeah, we have medical in quite a bit of states now, but now we have medical in states like Florida where you can't grow it. You know what I mean? Stigma, the right wing, like we said before, is having a moment right now. So now there's all these people that are like, oh, goddamn potheads. Even myself, who I have such a loving family, and it's such a great family. I'm not talking shit about my family. I'm going to stop talking shit about my family on the podcast. But but even myself, I have family members that have prescriptions to Xanax, and I say something wrong during a family gathering, they're like, oh, smoke another one, dude. And it's stigmas. It's just stigmas behind all of this stuff, and it's still there. And I even feel that like cannabis isn't as popular as it was 5 years ago, 6-7 years ago, when we voted it in. But so the point is that we gave up a lot to get a little bit. We've got medical in. It's important. We should really focus on making sure that the medical system stays intact. But now is the time for organizations like NORML, whose goal is to normalize this stuff. It's really our turn now to really take a step up and show people that cannabis is, not only is it okay, but it's fucking cool, man.
Well, Carlos, I think you bring up a good point in that NORML and normalizing things, because there are other organizations that exist in the legalization space. There's a Marijuana Policy Project, there's Drug Policy Alliance, there's Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And some people are of the opinion that there can only be one, if you will. And I don't believe that. I believe that, even like in the conservation sector, there's the World Wildlife Fund, there's Greenpeace, there's the Sierra Club. Each organization has its unique approach to things. For NORML, it's always kind of been people on the fringes who want to support what consumers are doing, right? And then NORML gave people to come off the fringes, to be mainstream, to allow doctors and to allow medical professionals to come out of the green closet and be like, look, I smoke reefer and there's nothing wrong with it. Look, this is something that helps me. I would prefer to do this than Xanax. I would prefer to do this than Oxy and other painkillers. So it's interesting to see where we're going to go. Imani, I'm just curious to see what are your thoughts on that in the grand scheme of things. Where do you think NORML fits into the future as we move forward?
First of all, I thought you did a great job of just sort of explaining the fact that there are a multitude of organizations, because it's going to take all of us and a multi-pronged approach to get us to the point where cannabis is, as Joe Bondi likes to say, legal like lettuce. It's not conventional, right? I mean, unconventional. And it's just, hey, I consume cannabis. I have a drink, I take supplements. Like, we've got to move the cultural ball forward. And I feel like organizations like NORML, particularly something that has a state level chapter approach, so that people like you guys who are on the ground in your space, like, are helping to affect both policy and, consumer opinion and behavior. Like, I believe very strongly in NORML. It was the first organization in the space pushing for legalization. And it's really important to consider consumers, because at the end of the day, these are the people that are going to benefit. And it's great to have, businesses in the space and have a corporate approach. We need all of that in our cannabis community, but someone needs to be worried about patients and social consumers.
Well, let's discuss social concerns for a moment. I know New York, just like Illinois, tried to do social equity. And I did say try because I don't see it happening the way it's supposed to yet. It's still not rolling out exactly the way it's supposed to work because regulation tends to get in the way. Money definitely gets in the way.
Yeah, actually, Gary, let me just say, I alluded to that before. I personally think that part of the problem is that we had the best of intentions, but we didn't have the resources to provide those entrepreneurs that wanted to help get into the space with the technical support that they needed and the resources to actually start a business. The reality is that standing up a retail operation in New York could run you anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million. And for most people that want to be, prospective entrepreneurs in the space, raising that kind of capital just from their, personal network or like angel networks are almost impossible.
Yeah.
I think that there are people that have been approached with deals that aren't great. Like that part of the space is struggling, and I am hopeful that the legislature here will recognize this gap. I think they attempted to do that with set up the whole like store concept with Dasney that didn't work out the way that they had imagined, but I'm hopeful that eventually they will get that part right. And then there are a small number of folks that are fit into those categories and also have the capitalization to move forward, and we're seeing those places open. I'm thinking, for example, about Con Bud that was started by Cos Marte, who's an incredible entrepreneur, has this amazing story about going from, being in prison to starting a personal training operation that landed him on Ellen. And he has his Con Body, I think that's the name of the business, and the Con Bud like in adjacent spaces. So you kind of go in and it's this like giant space on the Lower East Side that is incredibly cool. I mean, he's somebody who was already a successful entrepreneur. He's politically connected. His brother is a council member here. So he falls into a small group of folks that were able to benefit because they had the resources and connections. And we see that the people who are able to benefit most are people that have access to resources anyway. So we really do need to move the dial when it comes to that. And it's an iterative process that I believe that, again, with the power of organizing, because that's how anything happens, that we will be able to get our legislature to commit to some sort of pathway to capital and technical training and resources. And actually, I need to acknowledge that the Office of Cannabis Management does have some training programs for people, but that's not enough.
There's always a lot of missed opportunities out there. And there's also people who totally miss the point when they go after money they shouldn't be going after. Yeah, I'm talking to you, Berner. I'm Milan, good guy, hey, buddy. Let's talk about who you're getting your money from, because you're screwing things up for yourself. You got a great model there, but take a step back and look at the big picture. Here in Florida, we actually had an opportunity that people just didn't even notice. When Nikki set up a whole hemp network, she gave people access to USDA loans that would have allowed people to cultivate, even if they didn't have a heck of a lot of money. And that all got put off to the wayside because people were seeing a grander scheme of things with CBD and things of that sort. They totally ignored the industrial hemp market, and they didn't take access to the things they wanted to. And now we have somebody in there who's trying to shut it down, who takes the entire hemp section of the Department of Agriculture website and removes it so that nobody can even see what the heck is going on or know how to move forward.
So it could be another giveaway to corporate donors.
Oh, and Gary, I'm glad you're talking about stuff getting deleted off of websites, because FDACS also deleted all the consumer complaints against TrueLeaf by medical patients from their website. If I'm not mistaken, they deleted everybody who was having issues around smoking moldy bud or finding stuff with pesticides or microplastics in it. So now you have this one bad operator in the state that essentially, you go to the Department of Agriculture for consumer safety, and they've deleted deleted it off the website. Ironically, you go look at the Commissioner of Agriculture's donations, and he's got a big ass donation there to his PAC from True Leaf. So it really has become a play to pay scheme, if you want to infer that. And if you all want to sue me at Truly for speaking the truth, well, then we'll just have to produce even more receipts so you can see that this is not libel, this is not slander. This is the fact that we know you all are paying to play in Florida. And frankly, we don't give a damn anymore. You all have become the Walmart of weed. Curaleaf has become the Target of weed. And frankly, nobody wants to buy your cheap shit.
This is not slander. This is valuable financial.
All right, there, Kano. Say it with your chest.
Buy Truly stock. That's what it's got. That's what it all comes down to.
I mean, I think you guys should. I think you should totally launch a consumer boycott of bad weed and force these companies, if they're gonna be the only players in the space, force them to get better and to do better for consumers. I think
that's
bad weed.
Actually, yeah, I think
people could get around that.
Our membership just might be calling for actually is a boycott of True Leaf. Actually, Curaleaf just put in a whole lot of money into the hemp bills now that they're back into committees. And what's the other one? Sutera. I think we also need to start focusing on politicians, on the politicians that are putting these bills forward. We need to actually protest them, let people in their district know that what they're doing.
I mean, frankly, if you take corporate weed money, we can't trust you. Because it's not a matter of you saying you're pro cannabis and you're anti-prohibition. It's really a matter of, do you support corruption? Do you support money in our political system? Because that's what it's become. People keep asking, why is the rollout in Georgia and Alabama delayed? And you can point to one company in particular, True Leaf, which has slowed up those licensing processes. As a matter of fact, in Alabama, Kim Rivers qualified for a social equity license as a minority. And I see Imani's eyes rolling back as how a white woman qualifies for a social equity license, And it's like Bill Burr said, I don't know how she took her Gucci booted foot over the line of oppression and managed to sneak over to that side, but it's driving me crazy.
Well, white women have benefited from affirmative action, so it's not just that. It's just that this is a country. This is a company. She's running a company that is clearly a behemoth in other places, and social equity licenses are designed to benefit people who need additional help and support because of historic wrongs that are systemic and lead to the conditions today. So that feels like an abuse of the system to me. I don't think that is wrong that a white woman benefited. I think that is wrong that a rich person who's running $1 billion company with challenges in other states and is basically like, running the Florida market and operating, in this way that doesn't allow for real competition, right? You basically own it, can then go to another state and do exactly the same thing. And the state is basically helping to support that. That is unfortunate.
What was that movie in the 90s where it was like the white guy that was like trying to be a rapper or whatever? And he was like, see this freckle right here? That's how I feel all over. I just have this picture of Kim Rivers.
You talking about Malibu's Most Wanted?
I don't think it was Malibu's Most Wanted. I think it was like an even more like a real underground movie. like it inspired Malibu's Most Wanted. But
man,
he was like, Florida, like, yo, look at this freckle, yo.
Yeah, that's crazy.
This is how I feel on the inside.
Yeah, no monopoly in Alabama, please. You just gonna run the whole South? Come on.
Well, look, we're coming up on
Mississippi. I'm sorry, you said Mississippi, right?
No, we're now. Mississippi is not going anywhere right now when it comes to cannabis, but Alabama and Georgia both have medical programs that are slow to roll out. The South is really the last bastion of prohibition, and we're seeing that. I want to move into the news. Imani, I want to thank you for coming on. If you want to stay on for the news, and you give you some commentary on our news stories real quick. But Carlos, let's go ahead and run the news segment.
Oh, okay. All right. 1 second.
Yeah, it's a button on your right, Carlos.
So while we're
smart ass, Gary.
well, while we're talking about the news and we're talking about advances in the South, South Carolina gave its final approval on February 14th to legislation SB 423, the Compassionate Care Act, to provide authorized patients certain medical cannabis products. It was a tight vote after several days of debate. Senators voted 24-19 to send the legislation to the House for further consideration. Unfortunately, in 2022, House lawmakers refused to take up a similar bill. 76% of registered voters in South Carolina support medical cannabis access, according to polling data compiled by Winthrop University. South Carolina is one of only a dozen states that have yet to implement a comprehensive medical cannabis access program in the United States. Authorized patients will have access to non-herbal formulations of cannabis. So South Carolina is basically taking the Florida model that we originally had, the same model that they've applied in Georgia and in Alabama, where you can't have access to smokable flower. And that stalls things very significantly, because you're going to have to grow the crops, and then you're going to have to blast everything into some type of concentrate or tincture that folks get. Now, as we talk about advances in the South, Virginia is advancing. Just ahead of the crossover deadline for 2024's legislative session, members of both chambers of Virginia legislature have approved competing measures to legalize and regulate the retail sale of cannabis for adults 21 and over. Both bills initiate retail adult use sales to begin on January 1st, 2025. Delegate Paul Krizek's House Bill 698 proposes a tax rate of 9% in lieu of any state or local retail taxes, where Senator Aaron Roos's Senate Bill 448 imposes a 16% tax in addition to any state or local sales taxes. So in Virginia, the legislature has decided, screw what the governor has to say. We're going to move forward with retail sales. They're just, politicians are arguing over how much they're going to tax it. So all in all, we at NORML have always been of the opinion, let's not tax things out of price for the average consumer. So we'll see how that moves forward. Looking at other states, Hawaii has advanced multiple marijuana reform bills in both their House and Senate. House chamber members for the Committee on Judiciary and Hawaiian Affairs have approved House Bill 1596, which reduces penalties involving possession of marijuana up to 1 ounce and marijuana-related paraphernalia to a fine of only $25 in a non-criminal offense. That is freaking awesome. Love to hear that. Love to see it. Committee members also advanced House Bill 1595, which facilitates state-initiated expungements for those with misdemeanor marijuana convictions. Under their existing law, only those convicted of possessing 3 grams of cannabis or less are eligible for expungement. Moreover, those eligible must petition the courts themselves to have their conviction vacated. Automatic expungements are definitely something we want to see more and more states adopting. And definitely want to see things moving forward. Also, in the Hawaiian Senate, members of the Health and Human Services and Judiciary Joint Committee voted to advance SB 3335, which seeks to regulate the adult use of the cannabis market. While some proponents have criticized specific provisions in the bill, law enforcement and other groups have come out strongly against any legislative effort in Hawaii to legalize marijuana, alleging that doing so will increase crime and negatively impact tourism to the state. I call bullshit on that, because if I can smoke a joint on a beach in Hawaii, I definitely would love to stop at a local Hawaiian bud and get some. So, we'll see how that shakes out. Now, for all the advancements, we always talk about 2 steps forward, 1 step back. South Dakota lawmakers have voted to roll back employment protections for state-registered medical cannabis patients. So while we're here in Florida fighting for employment protections, while they're in states like Maryland right now arguing for employment protections, in South Dakota, the House and Senate advanced SB 12, which rolls back certain employment protections for folks in the authorized medical cannabis space. Specifically, SB 12 permits employers to either fire or refuse to hire patients for safety-sensitive jobs if they test positive for THC metabolites in their drug screen. The legislation also prohibits patients from suing an employer for wrongful termination if they fail an employer-mandated drug test. Proponents of the bill included the Associated General Contractors of South Dakota, the South Dakota Retailers Association, and the South Dakota Home Builders Association. So just interesting enough to know where the money is behind these things of trying to roll back our civil liberties and our civil rights. But, in all legislation, it needs to be examined that there's some type of scientific basis behind it, especially when we talk about safety positions. People always bring up, well, if you legalize it and you let anybody get a job who smokes, what about bus drivers who drive drive the kids to school? Well, let's look at a study coming out of the Journal of Psychopharmacology. Patients exhibit fewer changes in driving performance following medical marijuana use. Australian researchers have assessed the simulated driving performance in a cohort of 40 patients authorized to consume cannabis. And what they found is that there is no significant changes from patients' baseline driving performance that would indicate psychomotor impairment. As a matter of fact, some people actually drive better while they're high because they're not so busy focused on a million and one other things, especially those of us with ADHD. We're just focused on the road trying to drive at the speed limit. Lastly, looking at data published in the Journal of Brain and Behavior, cannabis products provide sustained improvements in sleep quality for patients with insomnia. So the UK has been doing research with over 60 patients enrolled in their medical cannabis registry and finding that cannabis products were well tolerated and that they're associated with better sleep, reduced anxiety, and greater quality of life for those folks who just can't get shut down their brains and go to sleep at night. And that's the normal news with Big Kano.
Imani.
Of course, with Florida, no news is not always good news. We have okay. I'm not sure how much you've been following this, but we had one particular license that was set up originally in the 2017 law that created one minority license, which was the Pigford license, which was for people who were part of that case back in the 1990s, which was a good idea at the time because it was still 2017. We're 7 years later. These guys are 7 years older, and now we're holding on to the fact that they finally gave out that one license, which still has not been activated yet because the people who actually won that particular license out of a competitive process had the principal die prior to it being released, and they will not give it to his ascendants. And so they're trying to actually give it to the next person down, who actually is more concerned with selling it as soon as he gets it. To a non-minority firm. And during all this melee, people aren't even noticing the fact that the one license that this particular bill had set up still hasn't been given out yet. 7 years later, we still haven't even got a single equity license of any kind.
No, and they shouldn't be able to sell it to a equity firm. Like, it's meant to benefit, it's meant to provide this benefit to make up for centuries of abuse, and just having it benefit one or family or company or organization doesn't seem fair, especially since it's just the one license. So,
with all due respect, I told Senator Roussan, I said, people do not understand the difference sometimes between social equity and tokenism. And that one does not benefit as much as the other. And you can't assume that they're the same. If you give people one license, that is not social equity. That is tokenism.
I 100% agree with you, Gary. And I will just say, my sort of parting words for this conversation, and thank you for having me on, gentlemen. It's been great, is that cannabis voters are the sleeping giants in Florida and across the country. We can't agree on anything as a country except cannabis. And we've got to organize cannabis voters so that we can actually get legislation that works for consumers and everyone, not just, the true leaves of the world or the other privileged and powerful entities. It needs to benefit the people. We need the plant to belong to the people. And if we don't vote about it, it's not going to happen.
Well said, Imani. Well said. For those of you who are listening, hit that like and subscribe button if you're on Facebook, or YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, whatever that might be. Definitely, if you're on YouTube, please like and share. Feel free to join in and make your comments. We're here every Sunday at 11 a.m. in the rotation, talking about the latest in cannabis news. This is brought to you by the Suncoast chapter of NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. And for those of you who are interested in getting more involved in the cannabis activist space, maybe you're interested in getting involved in the industry and you don't know where to start, we actually have a general membership meeting coming up on the 29th of this month. For those of you who are members, you want to renew your membership. For those of you who are interested in coming out for the first time, by all means, Carlos, if you want to drop that link again in the chat or across the screen for folks, you can register. It is a virtual membership meeting over Zoom. By all means, click the link, register, sign up, and join us on the 29th at 7 p.m. I want to say a big shout out to Gary Stein, our political director, who's been doing big things to help us in Tallahassee maintain all the madness and chaos. Carlos, our deputy director, who's there in the studio in Chillum, making sure everything runs smoothly. And then thank you to Imani, our special guest today, and National NORML board member from New York. Imani, thank you again for joining us.
I've had a blast.
Imani, I got one question for you. Okay, blunt, bong, or joint?
Edible.
Nice. Nice. I'll add that on there.
See everyone next week in rotation.